Margaret Chen stood at the iron gates of the Victorian mansion, her worn suitcase trembling in her grip. The address on the crumpled newspaper clipping matched the brass numbers on the stone pillar, but she read it 3 more times anyway. 6 months of searching for work had taught her that hope was a dangerous thing to hold too tightly. The advertisement had been simple: cook needed for family of 7. Room and board included. Apply in person. She had circled it with shaking hands the morning after she'd sold her wedding ring to pay for another week at the boarding house. The gate creaked when she pushed it open, a sound that seemed to echo through the overgrown garden. Roses climbed wild along the pathway, their petals brown and forgotten. Margaret noticed the details because noticing had become her survival skill. The windows on the second floor were dark despite the afternoon sun. A bicycle lay rusted on its side near the front steps. A child's shoe sat alone on the porch, its mate nowhere in sight. Everything about this place whispered of a family that had stopped paying attention to itself. She knocked twice before the door swung open. The man who stood before her looked like he hadn't slept in years. Thomas Wright was tall and lean, with silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. His shirt was buttoned wrong. His eyes held the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much weight for too long. He studied her face for a moment that stretched into uncomfortable silence, and Margaret wondered if she should speak first or wait. She had learned that grief made people forget the normal rhythms of conversation. "You're here about the position," he said finally. It wasn't a question. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much anymore. "Come in. The children are at school. They'll be home in an hour." He stepped aside, and Margaret entered a house that smelled of dust and sorrow. The entrance hall was magnificent, with a crystal chandelier that caught the light in 1,000 fractured rainbows, but newspapers were stacked against the wall in yellowing towers. Mail lay unopened on a side table. A woman's coat still hung on the rack, and Margaret knew without asking that it had been there for a very long time. Thomas led her to the kitchen, and her heart sank. Dishes filled the sink in precarious towers. The counters were sticky with spilled juice and cereal. The garbage overflowed onto the floor. But beyond the mess, Margaret could see the bones of something beautiful. The kitchen had clearly been designed by someone who loved to cook. There was a 6-burner stove, copper pots hanging from an iron rack, and windows that overlooked what must have once been a vegetable garden. "My wife died 14 months ago," Thomas said suddenly, staring at those windows. "Cancer." It was fast. The children were 9, 8, 6, 5, 3, and 18 months. Now they're 10, 9, 7, 6, 4, and 2.5. Margaret felt the numbers like stones dropping into water. 6 children. The youngest barely more than a baby. She had lost her own husband 2 years ago to a factory accident, but they'd never had children. She'd never told anyone how that absence had become its own kind of grief, a hollow space inside her that echoed with the laughter that would never be. "I'm sorry," she whispered, because what else was there to say? "I've tried 4 other cooks," Thomas continued, his voice flat. "They all left. The children are difficult. They break things. They won't listen. Emma, the oldest girl, hasn't spoken a word since her mother died. The boys fight constantly. The baby cries all night. I work long hours at the firm. I'm a lawyer. I'm never here. I can't afford to be here because someone has to pay for this house and their schools and their food and everything else they need." He finally looked at her directly, and Margaret saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was desperation, raw and honest. "I can pay you a fair wage. You'll have your own room on the 3rd floor. Sundays off. You just need to cook 3 meals a day, keep the kitchen clean, and make sure they eat. That's all. Can you do that?" Margaret thought about the boarding house room with its narrow bed and cracked ceiling. She thought about the job interviews where people took one look at her widow's dress and decided she would be too sad to hire. She thought about the way hunger had started to feel normal. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if she was walking into something far more complicated than either of them understood. Thomas nodded once, sharp and quick, as if sealing a business transaction. "Good. They'll be home soon. Try not to let them scare you away on the first day." He walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, leaving Margaret alone with the mess and the silence and the ghost of a woman she would never meet but whose absence filled every corner of this broken house. They arrived like thunder at 3:15, the front door crashing open with such force that Margaret dropped the spoon she'd been using to stir soup. She had spent the past hour scrubbing the kitchen into something resembling order, her hands raw from hot water and the determination to make a good first impression. The shouting started immediately. "That's mine. You're a liar. Give it back." I hate you. The voices tangled together in a chorus of rage and pain, and Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, steadying her breathing before walking toward the chaos. The entrance hall had transformed into a battlefield. Two boys were wrestling on the floor, their school bags abandoned and spilling papers across the marble. A girl of about 6 stood on the stairs, screaming at a volume that seemed impossible for such a small body. Another girl, older, sat in the corner with her knees pulled to her chest, rocking slowly, her eyes fixed on nothing. A 4-year-old boy had found markers and was drawing on the wallpaper with methodical concentration. And in the midst of it all, a toddler sat crying, her face red and wet, her arms reaching up toward anyone who might notice her. Margaret's instinct was to shout, to demand order, to use the voice of authority that adults were supposed to possess. But she had learned something in her years of marriage to Robert, in those quiet mornings when he would come home exhausted from the night shift and she would make him breakfast without asking questions. Sometimes the loudest needs were expressed in whispers, and sometimes silence spoke more clearly than words. She walked to the toddler first. The little girl looked up at her with enormous brown eyes, and Margaret bent down slowly, holding out her arms. "Hello, sweetheart. I'm Margaret. You must be Lily." The child hesitated for only a moment before reaching up, and Margaret lifted her, feeling the weight of trust settle against her shoulder. The fighting boys noticed her then. They separated, breathing hard, both sporting the beginning of bruises. "Who are you?" the taller one demanded. He had Thomas's dark hair and a split lip that was bleeding slightly. Margaret met his challenging stare with calm. "I'm the new cook. You must be Daniel. 10 years old, I'm guessing. And you're Marcus, 9. She had memorized their names from the brief description Thomas had given her. "There's soup in the kitchen. Fresh bread too. I imagine you're hungry after school." "The last cook locked us out of the kitchen," Marcus said, his voice sharp with remembered anger. "She said we were animals." Margaret felt something hot and protective flare in her chest. Then she was wrong, and she shouldn't have been working here. "Come on. All of you. Kitchen. Now." She said it without raising her voice, but there was steel underneath the words. The girl on the stairs, Sophie, stopped screaming mid-breath, startled into silence. The 4-year-old, James, looked up from his artwork. Even Daniel, who seemed to be testing every adult he met, moved toward the kitchen. Only Emma remained in the corner, still rocking, still silent. Margaret paused, shifting Lily to her other hip. "Emma, there's a chair at the table with your name on it. Take your time, but I hope you'll join us." She didn't wait for a response, didn't push or plead. She simply turned and led the others into the kitchen, trusting that sometimes an invitation without pressure was more powerful than a demand. The soup was simple, chicken and vegetables, nothing fancy. But it was hot and fragrant, and Margaret had made enough for an army. She ladled it into bowls, cut thick slices of bread, and set everything on the table that she'd cleared and scrubbed until it shone. The children sat, wary and watching, as if expecting a trap. They had learned, Margaret realized, that kindness from adults often came with conditions. "Eat," she said simply. "There's plenty more if you want seconds." Daniel ate first, fast and desperate, as if someone might take the bowl away. Then Marcus, then Sophie. James needed help, and Margaret moved his chair closer, showing him how to dip the bread into the soup. Lily sat on Margaret's lap, accepting small spoonfuls and making humming sounds of contentment. They ate in silence at first, the only sounds the scraping of spoons against bowls and the soft smacking of small mouths. Then Sophie said, "This is good." It was barely more than a whisper, but Margaret smiled. "Thank you, sweetheart. My grandmother taught me to make it." "Our mama used to make soup," Marcus said suddenly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Daniel's spoon froze halfway to his mouth. James's eyes filled with tears. Sophie's lip trembled. Margaret felt the grief like a physical presence, settling over the table like fog. She didn't try to dispel it or change the subject. "Tell me about her," she said quietly. "Tell me what she made." The stories came slowly at first, then faster, tumbling over each other. Their mother had made pancakes on Saturday mornings, always in funny shapes. She had sung while she cooked, songs they couldn't quite remember but could still almost hear. She had let them help, even when they made messes, even when they broke eggs on the floor. She had laughed when James got flour in his hair. She had taught Emma to measure ingredients. She had made birthdays magical with cakes that looked like castles and dragons and whatever they dreamed of. She had been there, always there, until suddenly she wasn't. Margaret listened to every word, storing them away like precious stones. She didn't say that time would heal them or that their mother was in a better place or any of the empty phrases that people offered to the grieving. She just listened and served second helpings and wiped James's face with a gentle hand. And when she looked up, she saw Emma standing in the doorway, silent as a ghost, her eyes fixed on the empty chair at the table. "That was Mama's chair," Daniel said, his voice challenging again. "Nobody sits there." Margaret nodded. "Then it stays empty, until Emma decides what should happen to it." She looked at the girl directly. "Your soup's getting cold, honey, but I can warm it up if you'd like to sit." Emma didn't speak, but she moved. Slowly, carefully, she walked to a different chair, one between Sophie and Marcus, and sat down. Margaret set a bowl in front of her, and Emma picked up the spoon with trembling hands. The first sip brought tears that rolled silently down her cheeks, but she kept eating. They all did. And in that moment, in that kitchen filled with grief and soup and 6 broken children, Margaret felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a job. This was something else entirely, something that terrified and called to her in equal measure. When Thomas came home at 8 that night, he found the children bathed and in pajamas, the kitchen spotless, and Margaret sitting in the dim light reading James a bedtime story while Lily slept on her shoulder. He stood in the doorway, watching, and Margaret saw the expression on his face. It was hope, fragile and afraid, like a bird with a broken wing trying to remember how to fly. 3 weeks passed, and Margaret learned the architecture of their pain. Emma's silence was not stubbornness but protection, a fortress built around a heart too wounded to risk more words. Daniel's anger was grief wearing armor, lashing out before it could be hurt again. Marcus's constant fighting with his brother was a desperate attempt to feel something other than the numbness that had settled into his bones. Sophie's screaming was the voice of a 6-year-old who had never been allowed to fall apart when her mother died because someone had told her to be brave. James's artwork on every surface was his way of making permanent marks in a world where the most important person had been erased without warning. And Lily, sweet Lily, cried at night because she was beginning to forget the face that had once meant safety. Margaret developed routines because children drowning in chaos needed something solid to hold on to. Breakfast at 7, always the same. Oatmeal on Monday, eggs on Tuesday, pancakes on Wednesday, toast and fruit on Thursday, waffles on Friday. She packed their lunches with notes tucked inside, simple messages. "You're brave. You're strong. You're loved." She was there when they came home, always in the kitchen, always with snacks and patience. Dinner at 6, homework at the table where she could help. Baths at 7:30, books at 8, lights out at 9. The older children resisted at first, testing her, pushing boundaries that had dissolved in the months of their father's grief. But Margaret held firm, not with punishment but with unwavering presence. Thomas watched from the margins of his own home, arriving late and leaving early, a ghost in a suit who signed permission slips and paid bills but couldn't bear to look at his children's faces for too long. Margaret saw the way he avoided the photographs on the walls, the way he took the long route through the house to avoid passing the master bedroom, the way he spoke to his children in brief sentences that required no emotional response. He was surviving, not living, and his survival was slowly suffocating everyone around him. One night, Margaret found him in his study at midnight, staring at legal documents without reading them, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "They asked about you at dinner," she said from the doorway. He didn't look up. "I'm sure you handled it." There was no malice in his voice, only exhaustion. Margaret stepped into the room, uninvited but determined. "Mr. Wright, they need more than food and clean clothes. They need their father." Now he looked at her, and his eyes were hollow. "I don't know how to be what they need. I don't know how to be in this house without her. Everything reminds me. Every room, every sound. Emma has her eyes. Marcus has her laugh, when he laughs, which is almost never now. James was her baby. She was nursing Lily when she got the diagnosis. How am I supposed to walk around this place pretending I'm fine when I'm not? When I'll never be fine again?" Margaret understood. God help her, she understood too well. You're not supposed to be fine. You're supposed to be honest. They think your absence is rejection. They think you can't stand to be around them because they remind you of what you lost. They're children, Mr. Wright. They don't understand complicated grief. They only understand that Mama died and Daddy disappeared. Her words landed like stones in still water, and she saw him flinch. "I'm not disappearing. I'm working. I'm providing for them." His voice rose, defensive, and Margaret didn't back down. "You're hiding, and they know it. Daniel fights because he's angry that you won't look at him. Emma won't speak because when her mother died, her father stopped listening. They're drowning, and you're standing on the shore watching because the water scares you. I understand that. I do. But understanding doesn't make it right. The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Thomas set down his glass with a sharp click. You've been here 3 weeks, Mrs. Chen. You don't know anything about my family or what we've been through. You're right, Margaret said quietly. I've only been here 3 weeks. But I've been a widow for 2 years, and I know what it's like to wake up in a bed that's too empty and wonder why you should bother getting up at all. I know what it's like to set 1 plate at dinner instead of 2 and feel like you're eating in a graveyard. I know what it's like to hear a laugh that sounds like the person you lost and want to tear your own heart out because the pain is unbearable. So yes, Mr. Wright, maybe I don't know your specific grief, but I know grief. And I know that these 6 children didn't ask to lose their mother, but they're about to lose their father too if you don't wake up. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping hard against the floor. For a moment, Margaret thought he might ask her to leave, might tell her she'd overstepped every possible boundary. Instead, he walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the glass. I don't know how, he whispered, and it was the most honest thing she'd heard him say. I don't know how to be in the same room with them without falling apart. I don't know how to answer their questions about where Mama is. I don't know how to make pancakes the way she did or remember which kid likes which bedtime story or any of the 1,000 little things she just knew. I'm failing them. Every single day, I'm failing them. Margaret moved to stand beside him, not touching but close. Then fail better tomorrow. Show up to breakfast. Sit at the table even if it hurts. Ask Daniel about school. Help Marcus with his homework. Read James a story. Hold Lily. And Emma just needs you to sit with her in the silence. You don't have to have answers. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present. Thomas was crying now, silent tears that tracked down his face in the reflection of the window. What if I can't? What if I'm broken in a way that doesn't fix? Then you're broken in the same house with 6 other broken people, Margaret said. And maybe that's enough. Maybe being broken together is how you start to heal. She left him there with his grief and his whiskey and his fear, and she went upstairs to check on the children one last time before bed. Emma was awake, sitting in the window seat of the room she shared with Sophie, staring out at the dark garden. Margaret sat down beside her, and they stayed there in silence, 2 people who understood that sometimes words were useless against the weight of loss. The next morning, Margaret came downstairs at 6:30 to start breakfast and found Thomas already in the kitchen, staring at the stove with an expression of utter bewilderment. I thought I'd try to make pancakes, he said, gesturing at the disaster of flour and eggs on the counter. I don't remember how. Margaret felt something warm bloom in her chest. Lucky for you, I do. Get the griddle. They worked side by side in the early morning light, and when the children came down, they found their father flipping misshapen pancakes and laughing at his own incompetence. It wasn't everything. It wasn't enough. But it was a beginning, and beginnings were how broken families learn to breathe again. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that buried the garden and turned the mansion into an island of warmth in a sea of white. Margaret had been with the Wright family for 4 months, and the house had begun to remember what it meant to be a home. Laughter echoed in the hallways now, though it was still tentative, still fragile. Thomas came home for dinner most nights, though he often sat silently, watching his children with an expression that suggested he was memorizing their faces. The children were learning to navigate their new reality, this strange constellation where their mother's ghost still lived in every corner but their father was slowly coming back to life. Emma broke her silence on a Tuesday afternoon in December. Margaret was baking cookies with James and Lily, flour dusting every surface, when Emma walked into the kitchen and said, Mama used to let me cut the shapes. Her voice was rusty from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but it might as well have been a thunderclap. Margaret's hand stilled on the rolling pin. James dropped his cookie cutter. Lily clapped, not understanding the magnitude of the moment but feeling the shift in the air. Then you should cut the shapes now, Margaret said, keeping her voice steady even as her heart raced. She handed Emma the star-shaped cutter, and Emma pressed it into the dough with trembling hands. That night at dinner, Emma spoke again. Pass the salt, please. 3 words, casual and ordinary, but Daniel started crying into his mashed potatoes and Marcus hugged his sister so hard she squeaked in protest. Thomas left the table abruptly, and Margaret found him in the hallway, his back against the wall, his shoulders shaking. She sounds so much like her mother, he choked out. That's exactly how Caroline would say it, with that little lilt at the end. Margaret stood with him in his grief and his joy, because they were the same thing now, inseparable as roots and earth. Christmas came, and Thomas asked Margaret if she would help him understand what the children needed. They sat in his study late at night, going through Caroline's journals that he'd finally been able to open. His wife had written about each child, their quirks and fears and dreams. Emma wanted to be a veterinarian. Daniel loved astronomy but was afraid to admit it because he thought it made him seem soft. Marcus had nightmares about losing more people and needed reassurance that everyone was okay. Sophie wanted her mother's jewelry box, not the jewelry, just the box that smelled like perfume and memories. James needed someone to tell him it was okay to forget his mother's face because the guilt was eating him alive. Lily needed photographs, so many photographs, so she could know the woman who had loved her first. Together, they planned Christmas like a military operation. Thomas took the children shopping, actually spent time with them in stores, learning what they wanted and why. Margaret cooked for days, making Caroline's recipes from the stained cookbook she found on a high shelf. They decorated the tree together, all of them, and when Emma hung the angel on top, she said, "Mama bought this the year I was born." Thomas told stories about Caroline that night, funny ones and sad ones and everything in between. He showed them videos on his phone of their mother dancing in the kitchen, singing off-key, making faces at the camera. The children laughed and cried and asked to see them again and again. On Christmas morning, the house woke to the smell of cinnamon rolls and coffee. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway as Thomas sat on the floor in his pajamas, helping Lily unwrap presents, his hair sticking up in every direction, his smile genuine for the first time since she'd met him. Daniel got a telescope, and his face lit up like stars. Marcus got books about grief for kids, and he clutched them to his chest without shame. Sophie got her mother's jewelry box, and she opened it carefully, breathing in the scent of the past. James got a photo album that Margaret had made, every page filled with pictures of him and Caroline. Emma got a donation made in her name to the animal shelter, and she started crying happy tears. But the moment that broke Margaret was when Thomas pulled out a small wrapped box and handed it to her. "You're part of this family now," he said simply. "Caroline would have wanted you to know that." Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, and when Margaret turned it over, she saw the engraving, "For the woman who taught our hearts to beat again." She couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. She had not expected this, had not allowed herself to hope for this. She had been hired to cook, but somewhere along the way, she had become something else, something more. January brought new challenges. Daniel got into a fight at school, defending Emma from boys who mocked her for not talking. The principal called, and Thomas went to the meeting, and for the first time, he didn't apologize for his son's behavior. He stood up and said, "My son was protecting his sister. Maybe the question is why your students think it's acceptable to mock a child who's grieving." He came home and told Daniel he was proud of him, and Daniel cried in his father's arms for the first time in over a year. That night, Thomas knocked on Margaret's door, late, after the children were asleep. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice was different, nervous in a way she'd never heard before. They sat in the small sitting room on the third floor, the space that had become Margaret's sanctuary. Thomas looked at his hands, at the ceiling, anywhere but at her face. "I'm grateful for what you've done for my family. For my children. For me. You've given us something I thought we'd lost forever. You've given us hope." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Wright." He shook his head. "No. You stopped doing a job months ago. You're loving them, Margaret. You're loving them the way they need to be loved, and I don't know how to thank you for that." The silence stretched between them, filled with things neither of them knew how to say. Finally, Thomas looked at her directly. "I'm not trying to replace Caroline. I could never replace Caroline. But I'm also not the same man I was when she was alive. I'm someone different now, someone who's learned that life doesn't stop just because you want it to. And I see you, Margaret. I see how you put extra blankets on Sophie's bed because she gets cold. I see how you cut the crusts off James's sandwiches because he won't eat them otherwise. I see how you leave Emma's door open a crack because she's afraid of the dark. I see how you're building a life here with us, and I'm hoping, that you might want to stay. Not as the cook. As something more." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. This was territory she had not allowed herself to imagine. "Mr. Wright, Thomas," he interrupted. "Please. Just Thomas." She nodded slowly. "Thomas, your children have been through so much loss. They're just starting to heal. I won't do anything that might hurt them. I won't risk becoming someone they depend on and then leaving. I'm not asking you to leave," Thomas said urgently. "I'm asking you to stay. Permanently. Not just as someone who works here, but as someone who belongs here. The children love you." He stopped, swallowed hard. I care about you, Margaret. More than I thought I'd ever care about anyone again. Margaret felt tears burn behind her eyes. This is complicated. Your wife would want her children to be happy, Thomas finished. She told me that before she died. She made me promise that I wouldn't let grief destroy our family. She said that if someone came along who could love our children, I should let them. She gave me permission to move forward, even though I haven't been able to until now. Until you. The weight of his words settled over Margaret like snow, cold and clean and terrifying. She thought of her small room on the 3rd floor, the sanctuary she'd carved out of a house that had been filled with grief. She thought of her wedding ring, long since sold. She thought of Robert, and the love they'd shared, and how he would have wanted her to be happy. She thought of 6 children who had started calling her Miss Margaret and sometimes, in their sleepy moments, just Maggie. She thought of Emma's voice returning. She thought of Thomas's smile. She thought of a life she hadn't dared to dream of. I'll stay, she whispered. Not as the cook. As someone who belongs. Thomas reached out and took her hand, and for the first time in 2 years, Margaret felt the warmth of another person's touch and didn't flinch away from it. Outside, snow fell on the garden where roses would bloom again in spring. Inside, a family that had been broken was learning to rebuild itself, not into what it was, but into something new and different and beautiful in its own way. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks and struggles and moments where grief ambushed them all. But they would face it together, this strange constellation of people who had found each other in the aftermath of loss and decided that love, in all its complicated forms, was worth the risk. Spring came gently that year, coaxing green from the frozen earth like a promise being kept. Margaret stood in the garden with Emma, planting roses where weeds had grown wild. Thomas had hired landscapers to clear the worst of the overgrowth, but Emma had asked to do this part herself, to put something beautiful where neglect had lived. Mima loved roses, Emma said, her voice stronger now, used more frequently. She said they taught you that beautiful things have thorns, and that's okay. The thorns don't make the flowers less beautiful. Margaret handed her the small shovel. Your mother was a wise woman. Emma nodded, digging carefully. Are you going to marry my dad? The question hung in the air between them, direct and unafraid. Margaret had learned that children, especially children who had faced loss, had no patience for dancing around truth. Would that bother you if I did? She asked carefully. Emma kept digging, her face serious with concentration. Sophie thinks you're going to leave like Mama did. Not die, but leave because we're too much work. She cries about it at night when she thinks I'm asleep. Margaret felt her heart crack open. Oh, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. I promise you that. Promises don't mean anything, Emma said flatly, and there was such ancient sorrow in her 10-year-old voice that Margaret wanted to weep. Mama promised she'd be there for my first day of middle school. She promised she'd teach me to drive. She promised a lot of things, and then she died. Dying isn't leaving on purpose, but you still end up gone. It was the most Emma had said in months, and Margaret understood that this was a test, a wall the girl had built around her healing heart to see if this new person in their life would be honest or offer empty comfort. You're right, Margaret said, setting down her own shovel and turning to face Emma directly. Death takes away promises whether we want it to or not. Your mother didn't want to leave you. She fought to stay as long as she could. But you're also right that she's gone, and that's not fair, and it's okay to be angry about it. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Everyone says I should be grateful for the time we had. Everyone says she's in heaven watching over us. Everyone says she wouldn't want me to be sad. But I am sad. I'm so sad all the time, and I miss her so much it feels like I can't breathe. Margaret pulled Emma into her arms, and the girl collapsed against her, sobbing with the force of 14 months of held-back grief. They knelt together in the dirt, surrounded by roses waiting to be planted, and Margaret let Emma cry until there were no tears left. Your mother's death was not fair, Margaret said when Emma's breathing finally steadied. And you get to be sad for as long as you need to be sad. Loving me, letting me into your life, doesn't mean forgetting her. It doesn't mean replacing her. It means your heart is big enough to hold both grief and new love at the same time. That's not betrayal. That's survival. Emma pulled back, wiping her face with dirty hands, leaving streaks of mud across her cheeks. Do you love us? For real, not just because it's your job. Margaret looked at this fierce, wounded child and felt the truth of it settle in her bones. I love you for real. I love all 6 of you in ways I didn't know I could love. You're not my job anymore. You're my family, if you'll have me. Emma studied her face for a long moment, searching for lies or doubt. Whatever she found must have satisfied her, because she nodded once, sharp and decisive. Okay. You can marry my dad. But you have to know that we come with him. All 6 of us. We're a package deal. Margaret laughed, surprised and delighted. I wouldn't want it any other way. They finished planting the roses together, and when Thomas came home that evening, he found them both covered in dirt, laughing about something James had done with the garden hose. He stood watching them, and Margaret saw the expression on his face, the wonder and gratitude and cautious joy. That night, after the children were in bed, Thomas took Margaret to the garden under the stars. The roses they'd planted were small and fragile, but they would grow. Everything would grow, given time and care. Emma says you have her permission to marry me, Thomas said, and there was humor in his voice but also something deeper, something vulnerable. Is that something you'd want? Marriage, I mean. To me. To all of us. Margaret looked up at the stars, the same stars that had looked down on her grief 2 years ago, on her loneliness and her fear and her desperate hope for something more than survival. Yes, she said simply. But Thomas, I need you to understand something. I loved my husband. I still love my husband. That doesn't go away just because I'm choosing this life with you. And you loved Caroline. You'll always love Caroline. We're not trying to erase our first loves. We're trying to build something new while honoring what we had. Thomas took her hands in his. I know. Caroline told me once that the heart doesn't divide love, it multiplies it. She said that every person you love makes you capable of loving more, not less. I didn't understand what she meant until you came into our lives. He pulled a small box from his pocket, and Margaret's breath caught. This isn't Caroline's ring. That belongs to Emma now, for when she's older. This is new, for us, for whatever we're building together. Margaret Chen, will you marry me? Will you be the mother my children need? Will you be the partner I never thought I'd find again? Margaret looked at the ring, simple and beautiful, and then at the man holding it, this father who had learned to show up, to be present, to love through his pain. She looked at the house behind them, glowing with warm light, filled with 6 children who had taught her that family was something you built, not just something you were born into. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from widow to cook to something she couldn't quite name but felt in every cell of her body. Yes, she said. To all of it. Yes. They married in the garden that summer, with the roses in full bloom and 6 children as the wedding party. Emma read a poem she'd written about grief and hope and how sometimes the best families are the ones you piece together from broken parts. Daniel walked Margaret down the aisle, his telescope in his pocket because he never went anywhere without it anymore. Marcus and Sophie scattered flower petals. James carried the rings on a small pillow, walking very slowly and seriously. Lily toddled behind in a white dress, waving at everyone and stealing the show. The ceremony was simple. The minister spoke about love that heals and families that choose each other. Thomas cried when he said his vows, and so did Margaret, and so did most of the small gathering of friends and family. But they were good tears, the kind that watered new growth. When the minister pronounced them married, all 6 children rushed forward and wrapped their arms around both of them, creating a tangle of family that was messy and perfect and exactly what it needed to be. That night, after the celebration ended and the children finally fell asleep, exhausted from dancing and cake, Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch watching fireflies drift across the dark garden. Do you think we can do this? Thomas asked quietly. Blend 2 griefs and 6 children and 2 broken people into something whole? Margaret leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the reality of this new life they were choosing. I think we're already doing it. Every day, in small ways. We're not trying to fix what's broken. We're learning to live with the cracks and love each other anyway. The years that followed were not easy, because healing never is. There were nights when Emma woke screaming from nightmares about losing more people. There were days when Daniel's anger flared hot and destructive, and they had to hold him through it. There were moments when Sophie tested Margaret's love with deliberate misbehavior, needing proof that this new mother wouldn't abandon her. There were times when Marcus retreated into silence so deep they worried he might never come back. There were afternoons when James asked questions about his birth mother that Margaret couldn't answer, and they had to sit together in the not knowing. There were mornings when Lily looked at photographs and asked why she had 2 mothers, and they had to explain death and love and memory to someone still learning to tie her shoes. But there were also triumphs. Emma got accepted to veterinary school and called Margaret crying with joy. Daniel won a science fair with a project about star navigation and dedicated it to both his mothers. Marcus became a counselor who helped other grieving children find their voices. Sophie kept her mother's jewelry box on her dresser and added Margaret's pearls beside it, saying both women deserved to be remembered. James became a photographer who captured families in all their complicated beauty. Lily grew up calling Margaret Mom, and Caroline Mama, who lives in my heart, understanding that love didn't require choosing between them. Margaret never forgot that she had been hired as a cook for 6 children and their father. But she also knew that sometimes the best things in life come from showing up to do one job and discovering you were meant for something entirely different. She had walked through the gates of that mansion as a widow looking for work, and she had become a mother, a wife, a builder of broken things made beautiful. The house that had been filled with grief learned to hold joy again. The garden that had been overgrown bloomed with roses every spring. And the family that had been shattered pieced itself back together, not into what it was before, but into something new and precious and worth every difficult step of the journey.